So first of all, thank you so much for joining us for another Moving to Mexico Monday on Zoom. We are loving this new format, and so we really appreciate you joining us. I'm saying us, tonight it's just me, Kim Temple with Runaway Realty in Puerto Morelos, Mexico, the best little beach town in the world, but definitely in Mexico, in my opinion. And we have Runaway Realty, my husband and I have Runaway Realty here in Puerto Morelos. It's a real estate agency focusing solely on Puerto Morelos real estate. But we do this Moving to Mexico Monday program where we chat about topics specific to Puerto Morelos, but also the broader general questions that come up when you're considering a move to Mexico anywhere in the country. So tonight, we are going to talk about well, I started the outline. So basically we're talking about kind of this phenomenon of Margarita Fever and what that means for you as a potential buyer in Mexico. And it's funny because when I moved here and started doing real estate, I heard people talk about Margarita Fever and I was like, oh, people get drunk and maybe they buy things. I really thought it was like a drinking fever, but it's actually not. But cheers, let me just give you a cheers with my margarita right now. It's really something that they've identified, and now I've seen after 9 years here, that sometimes people come to, I'm gonna use Puerto Morelos because that's where we are, come to Puerto Morelos, fall in love with it, fall in love with the culture, think it's beautiful, and decide that they wanna, look at property or just think about moving here, and they'll end up kind of hooking up with someone who seems nice, he's great, he's the taxi driver who speaks English and he takes you to meet his family and he's your best friend, or he's the waiter at the resort that you come to every year and he always brings you your drinks and he's so nice and he took you home to meet his family. You work with them to buy real estate and you kind of check your common sense at the border, they say, and then you are disappointed. So I think sometimes people get offended when we talk about Margarita Fever, but it's not meant to be a judgment. It's meant to be a warning to people that yes, Mexico's amazing. You can own property in Mexico as a foreigner safely, and we can do the transactions completely safely and confidently, but you have to do your homework and do your part too. So, and part of that is learning and educating yourself on how things work and how to protect yourself. So you don't get stuck making a decision that you wouldn't otherwise make and then regretting it. And I think for me, it's kind of a hot button because, I hear and have people come into my office and talk to me who are thinking of buying here and they'll say, but Kim, this actually just happened a few months ago. We've heard so many horror stories about buying in Mexico. We're very afraid. And I say to them, I have also heard many horror stories. In fact, I've heard many horror stories right here in Puerto Morelos. And when I've dug deeper into them, what I have found in every case is that a buyer made a really silly decision. And the decision was, I'm just going to work with this person. And even though my red lights are going off, and even though, I've talked to them because I've cleaned up several messes. And they've said to me, Kim, I knew something was wrong, but she told me this is how it's done in Mexico, so I just did it. And so they even ignore their own gut feeling because they've either fallen in love with a particular property or they just really got on with this person and they trust them. So, so it does happen, and I don't want any of you to become a horror story, and I don't want you to feel like this is what happens all the time, because it's not. There are some situations where people made bad decisions, and I'm sure there are situations where people really did get defrauded and through no fault of their own. Maybe there was a sketchy developer or something like that, and they lost money. It happens in Mexico, it happens in the US, it happens in Canada. And so I want to help arm you and provide you with information to protect yourself when you're looking here. And we have a buyer's guide about the 7 things you need to know before buying in Mexico. I don't know if you guys have looked at it. We're kind of going to follow that. But as I was preparing my outline for this meeting, I realized that kind of it all boils down to the first thing that I mentioned in that handout, which is you have to work with a professional agent. And I know I hate that that sounds self-serving because that's what I am. And of course I'm in the business and I'm doing this because I want to build my business as well as, you know, you're all going to be my neighbors someday. So I want us all to be friends and blah, blah, blah. But really that's how you're going to protect yourself. And so, yeah, so the number one thing is please use a professional agent. And how do you know in Mexico if you're, well, let me back up. The reason why you want that is, it's especially this year, it's been so crazy. There's all these people showing up in town and they're like, oh, I've been here since December and I'm a real estate agent in California, so now I'm a real estate agent here. Well, if you don't have a real estate license in Mexico and you don't have permission to work in Mexico and you don't speak or read Spanish or understand Mexican laws, you're not the person I want, you know, helping people buy property in Mexico because you don't even know the questions to ask. We're not, we're not in another state of the United States. We're not in another province of Canada. We're in a completely separate country with completely separate cultural ideas about buying and selling real estate, completely different laws of real estate and possession of real estate, and frankly, not as many chances to remedy a wrong because you're a foreigner in a country with a legal system that is very slow moving and expensive if you're not on the ins, right? So whereas a Mexican person might make a mistake or have something happens and they have some legal recourse, I think as a foreigner, our rights are, it's harder for us to succeed in a court of law, especially against a Mexican citizen. So we have to be extra careful. All right, I think I went off on a tangent, but anyway. So the first thing you need to do is make sure that you're working with someone who is a licensed real estate agent in Quintana Roo, which is the state that we're in. If they don't have a license, the licensing requirement has now been in place for 5 years, so there's really not much of a reason for people to not have license at this point. Let me show you what they look like. This is my real estate license. It's just, there's no picture or anything, but so the licensing requirement has been in place for quite some time. We've all been in the process of getting them. It is slow moving, but really everyone who's applied should have them by now. And what was required was, for me, I had a federal certification before there was a licensing requirement here. And I was able to kind of bootstrap that into my state license. And I had to do some more training, but really I'd already done the 90-hour certification and I had years of experience by the time the licensing requirement came in. Now, as new licensees, like Gabrielle had to take a course and get 90 hours of training, and he has on-the-job training under a broker. So it's important because if you just show up in Mexico and suddenly decide you're a real estate agent and you haven't had any of the training or understanding or work under somebody who has experience, you just don't even know what the pitfalls are. You can't help your client. You can show properties, but getting them through a transaction safely and at minimal risk to their money is a much trickier thing. Anyone can show properties. It's the other part that's more important. So anyway, you need someone who has had some training, who has had some experience. If they don't have a license, but they're a member of a real estate association, this is the biggest one. It's called AMPI, A-M-P-I. There's another one called CANACO, C-A-N-A-C-O. Those are the two to look for. The other things I would look for are, you know, do they have referrals? Do they have someone you can call who's actually bought a property with them? Do they have an office? Do they have a website? All of those things are indications that they're actually in the business of real estate and not just doing this as a side job, just trying to make money that they're not going to declare anywhere. So those are some indications that you're working with someone who's got some training to be able to help you. I know I had on my list also, check how long they've lived and worked in Mexico. If you've just arrived in Mexico, I can tell you, you don't know what you're doing because things don't work the same here. And even 9 years into this, 9 years, I still have situations come up where I have to call someone in our real estate association who's been a broker for a long time and say, what would you do if you saw paperwork like this? Or I call our attorney and say, take a look at this before I take this listing because it doesn't look like this is the person that owns this property. So anyway, I don't want to beat this to death, but just protect yourself by working with a professional agent. And that agent is going to educate you on the other things that you need to be aware of. You need to understand your ownership options. As a foreigner, you're going to own property in a real estate trust called a fideicomiso. There are very limited times you might want to open a Mexican corporation to own property. You can own property in a US corporation, but then the US corporation is going to be the trustee or the beneficiary of the fideicomiso trust. So when you work with an agent, they can talk to you about how to set up these different things, but that's something for you to know because even now, even though millions of Americans own and Canadians own in Mexico, there's still so much misinformation on the internet and people perpetuate it. I mean, I had a situation where, the couple just fell in love with their taxi driver who spoke English and introduced them to their family and became friends. And he told them that they couldn't own property without having him on the title, but he would take care of it for them. And they never obviously got their property. So, I mean, they believe that because there's so much misinformation that you have to have a Mexican on the title. You don't, you only own 49% of it. You don't, you own the whole thing, like all of this stuff out there. So understand your ownership options. We're not going to go through everything in detail tonight, but we will on March 1st. I'll go ahead and tell you this. We're having the real estate attorney that we work with do a program under Moving to Mexico Monday presentation on all of the ownership options for foreigners. So if you're interested in that, come back on March 1st. The other thing you need to understand is that to protect yourself, is that in Mexico, possession of property is like 11/10 of the law. So if someone were to propose to you a deal where you start paying for a property while they still live in it, you would never do that because you'll have a very difficult time proving you have you don't have any interest in a property and getting them out of it. So when we do deals, you don't take possession until you actually have paid for the whole property. You would never want to do a situation where you start paying for it and you're letting the owner stay in the property while you're paying for it. So, I mean, this is what I'm saying. It kind of all comes back to working with a professional agent. But just so you know, I mean, if you, God forbid, decide not to, don't get yourself in a situation where possession is unclear. Because trying to recover possession, excuse me, I'm gonna let somebody in. Trying to recover possession is very expensive and time consuming here, which is why we don't have mortgages, because the banks won't take the risk of loaning money against a property that they can't repossess efficiently. Okay, hi Amy, welcome. The other thing that you need to understand is what team you need to work with. In a real estate transaction in Mexico, you have a notario, and a notario is an attorney, and it's an attorney with like a semi-governmental qualification to transfer real property. So every transfer of real property in Mexico involves a notario. But what you need to understand is that although that is an attorney and you're going to pay for him as a buyer because you pay the closing costs, that attorney doesn't represent you. That notario is an independent third party who's just like a legal taskmaster, and their only job, they are going to certify that the property is, that you have clear title and they can't transfer the property without that. Hi, Shannon. But they're not looking out for your interests otherwise. So you need an attorney that you hire, that you are paying, that is going to review everything for you because everything's going to be in Spanish. Even if they provide you an English translation, that's not the official contract or the official deed. So you need to really understand what's happening. So your attorney is going to watch out for your interests there, and they're going to make sure that you're not signing anything that's incorrect or incomplete or has any questions. Here, we work with a good team that we love at Secure Title and Playa del Carmen, but there are many other attorneys who are also bilingual. We have French-speaking attorneys, French and English, like French and Spanish, that we can recommend for our French-speaking clients. But I can't stress this enough. You, on your team, need to have an attorney who's representing you. It doesn't cost much. Attorneys here make very little compared to attorneys in other places. And I would just consider it a cost of the closing. I mean, it would be silly not to protect yourself. You're in a foreign country where you have limited rights. You probably don't read or speak the language, and you don't understand the laws. So why wouldn't you have an attorney to represent you and protect you? And the attorney, by the way, has to be a Mexican attorney. I've had some clients who, but I have an attorney in the US and they know all about Mexican law. Well, I found that usually isn't true, but also the advantage of having a Mexican attorney here in this area is that they know how things work here in this area. And they have connections here in this area. So if you have an issue, you want someone who knows the players at the municipality, knows the players at the public registry in Cancun. They understand Desarrollo Urbano's requirements, say you're building a house and you run into trouble. So I think there's a huge benefit to having someone from this area to help you. It's time for a sip of my margarita. Does anybody have any questions so far? Anyone?
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
It's Doug.
Yeah. Hi, Doug.
Just in regards to the fideicomiso, there are, when I'm reading, there are fees every year that you have to pay for that. Is that correct?
Yeah. So there's an annual trust fee, and all of the banks are right around $500 US right now.
Okay, and that's in perpetuity of the actual fideicomiso and the length of it. It's 50 years, and then it can be done for another 50 years, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, every year you own the property in the trust, you're going to pay for the management of the trust, which is a total joke because they don't do anything except send you a bill. And that's why we're stuck with fideicomisos, right? Because everyone, the government is aware that Americans and Canadians don't love the fideicomiso idea. And they've tried to change the Constitution to get rid of the prohibition against foreign ownership in the restricted zone, but the banks have such a strong lobby. They're making a fortune. Imagine every Canadian and American who owns property in Mexico has to have a trust. So there's a whole government agency dedicated to this, which makes them money. The banks make $2,000 each time someone opens a trust or transfers a trust, and they get $500 a year during your ownership. And they get money if you happen to sell your property to a Mexican who doesn't need the trust, then they get to charge you to extinguish the trust. So they make money no matter what. And it's just part of it. They're not doing anything. They don't control your property. They can't manage your property. They can't enter your property. They send you a bill and that's it. And sometimes they don't even do that. You have to tell them, hey, do I owe you money this year for this thing? Oh, yes. Send it in. So it's a little bit, if you can't tell, I find it a little ridiculous. I mean, it's a legal fiction created to get around the prohibition in the Constitution. And it's what we have right now, but it's not ideal, I don't think.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. And if you want to, on March 1st, we're going to dig in deeper to the fideicomisos, if you want to come back for that one. Anybody else? Glenn's trying to join. Let's see if we can get him in here. Hi, Glenn. Oh, Glenn has two. Glenn's up here twice. I don't know what happened.
Sorry, I couldn't get my camera to work, so I started all over again.
It's okay. All right. So we covered, let's see, You're going to work with a professional agent. You understand your ownership options. You understand that it's all cash and that possession is an issue. You're going to work with an attorney, and the other big thing that you need to do is understand that you have the right, and I would highly recommend that you use an escrow account. In Mexico, usually until escrow accounts were available, you would just pay, you just give the money to the seller. The problem with that for foreigners, for us, is that we can't own property directly. We have to own it through the trust, and setting up a trust or transferring a trust if we're buying from other foreigners takes time. So the problem that people ran into was they would give a seller money, but then they needed another 2 or 3 months to get the trust together to close, and then the seller would be gone with the money. So now we have the option to use escrow accounts, and I highly recommend that you use an escrow account. An escrow account is just a trust account with funny name. I know that, and I think the Canadian escrow is like a bad word in Canada, I've heard. Yeah, okay. Shannon's saying yes. So I was really surprised to hear that. It's just a trust account. And it's, there's companies that offer this. They are just keepers of the money. The buyer puts the money, earnest money in, or the proceeds in, and that money is safe there until the notarios says at closing, I've transferred the title, and the buyer and the seller have signed. So no money comes out until everyone's signed off on it. So it's a safe way to keep the money. It lets the seller know that you're serious, you've put the money in, and you can't get it back unless for some reason the seller can't pass clear title. Or if you change your mind, you can withdraw it, except for there's a penalty probably in your contract. But the money is safe there, and you're not chasing some seller around trying to get your money back. So I highly recommend that you use escrow. Never, ever, ever give money to a real estate agent. We don't have trust accounts here. Agents don't. And how are you ever going to get that money back? You're not. So there are agents I've heard that ask people to give them money, and even sometimes ask you to give you, how do they do it? They have you give them the earnest money, and they hold it until the closing, I guess. But it's just, you don't need to do that. Have a separate company with a trust account and put the money in there. The agent has no reason to touch it. The agent gets paid at closing. And as a buyer, you really want your money to be protected. And they're not expensive. So Secure Title offers escrow accounts in US dollars and in pesos. I think MexLaw, which is a company in Playa del Carmen, offers, who I would never use for closing, but they have an escrow account in Canadian dollars, I believe. So that would be useful if you wanted to, for some reason in your transaction, the seller had agreed to accept Canadian dollars, you could do it that way. Which we've had a couple that did that actually, and we had to do it through a trust account in Canada. But use escrow. It doesn't cost much, and I would just consider it an insurance policy for your money, because it makes sure that the seller is not leaving with your money. Any questions about escrow accounts?
Hey, Kim, it's Harry. Just kind of curious. So you said you had a legal team of lawyers that your company trusts and recommends, or?
Mm-hmm.
That's true? Yeah.
Yeah. So we do almost all of our, well, I would say 99% of our transactions with Secure Title from Playa del Carmen. It's a law firm, but they also have an escrow account in New York City at Citibank. And they handle the closing coordination for most of our transactions. They've been in business for a very long time. They have a really good reputation, and I would recommend them to anybody. There are other, we have worked with other attorneys, but they do such a volume of transactions that they can kind of, they have some weight with the public registry. They have some weight with the fideicomiso banks when we need to, get the banks to step it up. So we feel very comfortable with them, although there's other closing people that we could recommend if you didn't want to work with them. I don't think they're the cheapest, but for us, it's worth it to pay a little more to know that your transaction is going to get done in a timely manner, and then it's going to be a good transaction, and it'll be filed in the public registry as soon as the closing is over.
How
But
long
sometimes-
how long does the process take in general? Let's say you've determined you wanted to buy a place and you come to an agreement with the seller on the price and the timing. How long does all this take?
Well, before COVID, it usually was taking around 30 to 45 days to do the whole transaction, unless you were in a holiday period like Christmas, where everything closes for everything closes for a month, and then Easter, everything closes for 2 weeks. If you're around those time periods, it could take a little bit longer. Now with COVID, everything is super backed up. I think Jim and Bonnie are buying, and we're probably looking at least a 2-month close for that one, if not more, because you're juggling a lot of like the municipal government, the federal government, the fideicomiso bank, the notario, and then you have parties who either have to travel to Mexico, which is tricky, or get powers of attorney in place, which can also take some time. So we're really seeing more like 60 to even 90 days to close, depending on the transaction. And that it's just, I think, everything was shut down for a while. And then when it reopened, we were not expecting the slam of, our market's on fire, and we're not the only one in the Riviera Maya. It's just been insane. So everyone is kind of struggling, and the banks aren't up to full capacity yet, because under the governmental rules, I think they can only be staffed to 60%. So, everyone's kind of coming from behind. So that's what's happening right now. It's taking a little bit of time. And I don't know when that's going to loosen up, honestly. Maybe if we go back to yellow, they can bring more staff in. Hi, Lori. Any other questions? You guys are very quiet.
I'm trying to eat my soup and listen in.
I'm gonna drink my margarita. So the other thing that we usually talk about in our in-person Moving to Mexico Monday meetings is this kind of idea that sometimes people arrive and they may just be walking down the street and see a for sale sign, and they end up talking to the owner, and they'll talk about a price, and the owner will say, but you can't use a real estate agent. And this can be a Mexican seller or a foreigner. And I've had some people come to me when this situation happens, because of course they're not comfortable not using an agent. And the reality is you can use an agent. Even if a seller tells you they don't want to use an agent, what they're saying to you is they don't want to pay, and they don't want to pay a commission. And maybe they're telling you, oh, you'll get I'm going to raise the price if I have to pay a commission. Well, the reason that you should have your own agent in that situation is in Puerto Morelos, particularly, and probably every kind of little town along the Riviera Maya, a lot of sellers are sitting on a huge capital gain, because it was very common for many years to buy property. Let's say you bought it for $200,000, you would say that you paid $50,000, which is kind of ridiculous. And you would do that because you pay less closing costs. You would register your sale at $50,000, even though you paid $200,000. So you'd pay closing costs on $50,000. And it worked because everyone down the line agreed to say they paid way less, like grossly. In fact, I had one today that I'm looking at where they said they paid $3,500 for a property that they actually paid $75,000 for. And now they're going to sell it at a time when the US dollar to the peso is 20 to 1, not 12 to 1 or 10 to 1, which has happened when they bought it, and everything's recorded in pesos. So in that case, That one was recorded at 72,000 pesos, and we're going to sell it for almost 2 million pesos right now. And so that's a huge gain. So what a lot of sellers are doing is, instead of themselves getting some tax advice or working with an agent to try to minimize their capital gains, they want to get an unsuspecting buyer to walk in and say, oh, I'm going to give you a great deal, but you can't have a real estate agent. And they're going to do the same thing to you. They're going to structure the transaction reflecting a much lower value than what you're paying, so that they don't have to pay the capital gains. So they're really shifting their gain to you. The problem is the government caught on to this years ago. And now with all the anti-money laundering regulations, it's very hard to hide money. So they know what you're really paying for property. And when they catch you lying about it, they're going to say, buyer, not only are we fining you and you have to pay what you should have paid in closing costs and purchase acquisition taxes, blah, 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 and you're going to pay everyone else's down the line behind you that didn't pay. So it's a huge no-no for buyers now to agree to register way lower than you paid, actually are going to pay for the property. So sellers know this. And so they're trying to get you to not use an agent, because they know that an agent is, I mean, ethically, we have to tell you that, and it's tax fraud. It always was tax fraud, and it's tax fraud now. And now with the money laundering regulations, an agent can get in trouble as well. So we have to disclose everything. And we have to report to the government how much you're paying. We have to report how much you're paying. The bank reports how much you're paying, the fideicomiso bank. The closing attorney has to report how much you're really paying, and so does a notario. So there's no way that they don't know how much you're actually paying for a property. So please don't get yourself in that situation. What you can do, and what is quite common, is when you buy real estate that's furnished, or, well, not even just furnished, like has light fixtures and plumbing, you can classify a portion of your purchase price as contents and register a little bit lower. Let's say you're going to buy a condo for $350, it's fully furnished, and obviously it has plumbing and a water heater. Well, let's do a house, because that's easier. If a house has a pool, you have the pool equipment, and you have all the lights and the plumbing and everything that is not real estate. It's not concrete or dirt. You can classify all that as contents, and you can register like, oh, I'm buying this house for $350. We're going to register $30,000 of that as contents, and we're going to register the sale at $330. Is that right? No, $320. If I have 30,000 in contents, then you would pay closing costs on $320. We show a sale of contents for $30,000, and then of course the seller gets the whole $350. You want to be careful when you do that, classify things as contents, because although it saves you at the beginning of the transaction, it saves you closing costs, it is also where they're going to measure your gain. So if you then turn around and sell the property for $450, your gain is going to be measured from $320, not the $350 that you actually paid. So you don't want to go too crazy, and also you don't want to trigger, red alarms with the tax department saying, "Oh, well, I'm sure they didn't just pay $300,000 for this property. We know that this is worth more." Anyway, so you can classify some as contents. You can register a little bit lower, but don't go crazy, because that's where they're going to measure your gain, and you may save 3% on your purchase acquisition taxes by registering lower, but the capital gain is 30%. So you're not really doing yourself any favors. So that's kind of a thing to know. And also just, I hope that you're working with professionals, but make sure that you are reading what you sign. So many people have come to me and said, well, here's my title, and they registered way lower, and they said, well, I didn't even look at it. I just trusted the people that gave it to me that it was right. And I'm like, but you can see the numbers, like they're numbers. You don't have to read Spanish to see that this number is way different than the number that you actually paid. But everyone kind of pleads ignorance, that they had no idea it was happening, and maybe they didn't. But that's why many times you will see properties here that are not listed with real estate agents. They're for sale by owner, and that is in many of the cases why, because they do not want you to know that they don't want to pay their capital gains. They want to ship that to you. And you are smart, because you came to moving to Mexico money, and you are not going to do that, because you know that you could get caught and you'll have to pay all the back taxes. It's not worth it. That's the hard thing though, because people fall in love with properties, and then when things like this come up, they're like, I don't care, it's that property, I have to have that property. And that's Margarita Fever, right? Like you wouldn't do that at home. You wouldn't do it, and you wouldn't trust the taxi driver, and you wouldn't, oh, but he's so nice and he plays golf and he's really smart and he owns 7 houses here. Okay, great. He may be smart and nice, play golf with him, but don't buy property. It's your life saving. In many cases, it's your life savings. This is your retirement. Like, why would you risk it? It's so weird to me, but it happens every year. All right, Margarita time. Any questions? Somebody
Hi.
talk.
It's Lonica from Calgary.
Hi,
How are you doing?
good.
Good. So when you say that the things are kind of crazy in the market right now, is it a buyer's market? It's a seller's market? What's going on down there?
It's our market's on fire. There's hardly any inventory. So it's
Okay.
definitely a seller's market.
Okay. Is that just you figure everybody's had COVID fever and they're ready to pack it in and leave Canada and the US?
Yeah, so I was just discussing this today with some other agents, and it's a few things. One is that, I think COVID has impacted a lot of people who either maybe took earlier retirement than they were planning. Maybe maybe they got off, a friend of mine did that. She got offered an incentive to take an earlier retirement than she was planning. People realized they could work from anywhere. People realized they could do school from anywhere. So we've seen a big influx of, families with kids that are still in school, which is interesting and fun. But also we're hitting, the baby boomers are there. Like, people are reaching retirement age and realizing it's very expensive to retire in the US, and probably, I don't know if it is still in Canada, probably, but I think that that's part of what we're seeing, the leading edge of that, people just realizing, it's real estate's not necessarily less expensive here, but living here is much more affordable and not so cold.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So I think all of that's playing into it, we were shocked, and I was talking to Gabrielle, like in June, we're sitting there thinking, oh my God, do we need to get a different job? Like, what's going to happen? And it's just been crazy. I will say one thing I forgot to mention is this also happened after the last US election. We had a very slow year leading into that. And we thought because people were not buying because everyone was so uncertain what would happen. And then like 3 weeks later, when the world didn't end and implode, our market went crazy in 2017. But for us personally, this year is much busier than even 2017, which was our busiest year on record in the Riviera Maya. And other brokers that I'm talking to down the coast are seeing the same thing.
Interesting.
So,
Thanks.
I don't have a great answer, but those are my ideas. And I think it's cold. I mean, anytime there's a real bad winter, which it seems like is happening, there's more interest here.
Yeah, for sure. Great. Thanks.
That's about it for me, unless you guys have some questions. I feel like I hate to be negative because you can have a wonderful, positive experience buying property. I just want you to be careful.
Kim, I have
That's all.
Tim,
Tim?
I have a question about closing costs.
Mm-hmm.
When you figure your price point, you have to figure so much for your closing costs, and I understand it's quite a bit, depending on the property that you buy.
Yeah.
Can you explain that a little bit?
Sure. So the closing costs can range from like 6% to around 12% and a little bit above that. And when I say closing costs, I'm including the cost of your attorney, the cost of an escrow account, the cost of the notario, the purchase acquisition taxes, the cost to set up or transfer a fideicomiso. If you're buying from another foreigner, you're just going to transfer it, and the first year annual fee. and some registration fees, which are not too bad. And some of those costs are just flat fees regardless of what price property. The fideicomiso costs the same whether you're buying a $3 million house or a $50,000 house. The purchase acquisition tax is pegged to the price though, so that's going to change, and that's 3.3%. So I'm lumping it all together, and when I tell you this, the buyer, the figures I'm telling you include everything the buyer would pay. There's no other cost for the buyer. So at the $300,000 range, you're looking at like 7 to 8% of the purchase price as a closing cost. At the $800,000 range, you're looking at like 5%, 5 to 6%. You know, $1 million, you're looking at more like 5%. At 150,000, you're looking more at 8 to 9%. And the lower we go, the higher percentage it is. Like I just sold a lot for 57,000, and the buyer's closing costs were close to 14% of the purchase price. Because, you know, she had to have a fideicomiso, you know, all of those flat fees are still there. The acquisition taxes are lower, but the other flat fees take up a chunk of that. So, so that's kind of the range. Do you have a price point you're considering?
No, we were looking at some properties around 330,000. We just wondered, you know,
Yeah.
what would something
So
like
you're probably about 8% there.
about 8%?
7 to 8%, yeah.
Okay. Good to know. Thank you.
And then the seller pays the real estate commission and the seller pays their capital gains. And they have some documents they have to provide that they pay for.
Okay. Thank you, Kim.
Sure. What else? Anyone?
I have a quick
I-
question.
Oh,
The one thing you talked about is the protection of for when you're buying stuff. At what point in the process is it that does somebody to make sure like the property taxes are all paid up, that it isn't in DAC, and all those bills are kind of taken care of? Is that handled in that process you're talking about with the closing?
so before you sign in our transactions with our buyers, before you sign the formal contract, which is in English and Spanish, which is the binding contract, and make sure earnest money non-refundable, you will know that the property title is clear. We will have received copies of the utility bills. We will have confirmed that there's no money owed for either property taxes or to an association, you know, if it's in an association. So we will have all that information before you commit your money. And then of course because we have a long process, they have to issue that and check it all the way up until the time of closing. Right. So I think when we close, the certification of no liens has to be within like 10 days. The notice from the association has to be within the month that we're closing. So there's no real chance for something to add up that we didn't know about. What else?
Hey, Kim.
Yeah.
So, well, we're up in Canada, we're in the Toronto area. When you actually go to do the purchase and also when you do the closing, is the buyer, would I normally and my wife have to be in Mexico to make that happen, or how does that work?
Yeah, so legally, someone has to be at the closing table. It's either you or someone with your power of attorney have to be physically at the closing table for closing.
And how about for the original offer? So let's say we found a property we liked. I guess we would be there as well.
We can do everything via emailing and scanning and FedExing except the closing.
Oh, okay.
So everything up to the closing can be done remotely. In fact, we sold a whole, I wish they were on here tonight. They're not here. Kathy and Mark were our first completely virtual. They saw it virtually, they bought it virtually, and then they showed up for closing and saw their house for the first time. And they love it, but that was stressful.
They bought it virtually, so they didn't even see it in person? Wow.
But I will say, in their case, it was in a condo complex and they had seen other units in the years that they've been coming here. So they were familiar with the complex. They knew what the units looked like, but they had never been inside the unit that they bought until the day before closing when they arrived in Mexico.
Wow.
I can see that.
Yeah, there's some condos that we've been to is that we would do that for sure.
Yeah, I mean, that was their comfort because they had been there before and we did it's, when you have a camera, we spent like 2 hours on there. We went through everything in the condo and so it was good, but that was so nerve wracking for me. Like, oh my God, what if they show up and they don't like it or they're not happy?
Kim,
I love it.
how much notice do you get? Like here in the States, a closing can happen suddenly, or it can take forever, and and then you get, oh, we're closing tomorrow. I'm just thinking about booking an airfare.
No, so the closing is by agreement of all the parties. So you and the seller would agree on when the closing can happen at your convenience because usually nobody's here. The buyer and the seller are both other places and have to get here. Or they have to get a power of attorney in place. So no one just surprises you and says, oh, you have to be here next Friday. It's set on your schedule. It can be frustrating, and I have a lot of frustrated buyers right now because they would like to make travel arrangements. You'd like to do that in advance sufficiently to not pay outrageous plane fees or flight, whatever costs. But because there's so many moving parts and because right now it's so unpredictable, we're saying don't make a reservation until they've received every single thing they need, and then we absolutely know we can close because we don't want you to get here, spend all that money, and now we have all the COVID testing requirement and find out that we need another week to close. So it is frustrating, and Jim and Bonnie are in that situation that we can't tell them when we're going to close. We have a general idea of when we would like to, but yeah, it's hard because there's so many moving pieces. I just want to look at there's some questions in the chat box. Okay. Oh, David, does anyone local express concern about gentrification? I wish Gabrielle were here. He might be a better person to answer that. I have not heard that. I think that, yeah, I haven't really heard that. I mean, I've heard the people that I hear it from are mostly Americans and Canadians worried about it. I don't hear that from the Mexican families that I know here. I know that, people have been bought out here at very good prices and they have had a very good life because of that. So I don't feel like there's a whole lot of negative connotation. And also, as you know, David, there's a lot of Mexican families who live here. I mean, this is a Mexican community. It's not even 50-50. I mean, I would say 90-10 still.
Does somebody purchasing a property and moving in, is there a ripple effect on say like real estate tax assessments or anything that impacts neighbors?
No, so the tax apparatus here, they don't go out and revalue properties every year. They're revalued upon sale. So the fact that somebody bought the lot next door or whatever, something for $500,000 and you have a little hut, it doesn't affect you. I mean, your taxes will not be revalued until you sell the property, and then they're valued at the new sale price or based on the new sale